In our last lesson on chapter 43, we are going to talk about 3 cases and 1 problem that were assigned for this chapter. And the first case that we're going to talk about is a case that was the underpinnings of the creation of the Time Warner Company. But before we get to that case, the Paramount versus Time case, we need a little bit of background about what led up to that particular piece of litigation. There is a special business judgment rule in the context of what we call hostile takeovers. I'm sure at some time or the other, all of you have heard that term, hostile takeover. But what exactly is a hostile takeover? A hostile takeover is when an outside party comes in over the objection of the board of directors who are managing the corporation to try to acquire majority control of that corporation. Now, the reason board of directors generally don't like an outside party coming in and taking majority control of the corporation is because the shareholders are the ones who elect the board of directors. If an outsider comes in and acquires, say, 51% of the shares of the corporation, the likelihood is that new majority shareholder is going to vote out the existing board of directors and bring in the people on the board of directors that the new majority owner wants. So when it comes to these kinds of takeovers, board of directors generally try to find some way to stop them from going forward. How these outside parties try to come in and take control of a corporation is done by something called a tender offer. A tender offer is an offer by this outside party to the shareholders of the corporation to buy their shares at a price that is above the current market price, to make it tempting for them. Right? So if the shares are trading at $25 a share, this outside party comes in and says, hey, I'll give you $30 a share if you'll sell me your shares. These hostile takeover attempts are sometimes attractive to the shareholders because they're looking at an immediate profit gain. But as I say, board of directors don't like them because it jeopardizes their jobs. So your textbook talks about a number of ways that boards come up with to try to prevent these hostile takeovers from being successful. You're not going to need to know what they are, the poison pill and all of those various things that are listed in your book. But there are various ways they've come up with to try to make these hostile takeovers not attractive to outside parties. If the board succeeds in fending off a hostile takeover, sometimes it really irritates the shareholders because they lost the profit that they could have gotten if the hostile takeover had gone forward and if they had been able to sell their shares at the greater price. The shareholders will sometimes sue the board, claiming that they breached their duty of care to the corporation, that they were just looking out for their own interests in dealing with these hostile takeovers. And as we've talked about, courts don't like to get involved in second-guessing the officers and directors of a corporation about the business judgments they're making. And that's why the business judgment rule came about. But by definition, the business judgment rule doesn't apply to hostile takeover attempts. Because if you recall, one of the elements of the business judgment rule is that in deciding to act in a certain way, the officer or director did not have a conflict of interest in making the decision. But when you look at these hostile takeover attempts, the board of directors almost always have conflicts of interest because one could argue they are trying to protect their tenure on the board of directors. They're trying to protect their job in fending off the outsiders' attempt to take majority control of the shares where they are likely to be voted off the board of directors. Rather than deciding that they'll have to just decide the issue on the duty of care elements, the courts have come up with a modified business judgment rule that is used solely in the event of a hostile takeover, because the courts realize they have to throw out that you can't have a conflict of interest element. And so with respect to hostile takeovers, the courts have come up with a new modified business judgment rule. And we called that modified business judgment rule the Unical rule because it was a case called Unical Corporation versus Mesa Petroleum Company, where the rule was first articulated. So the rule just refers back to the name of the case. And with respect, only with respect to a hostile takeover attempt, the Unical rule changes the business judgment rule. And with respect to actions where the board of directors have defeated a hostile takeover attempt, the board of directors have to satisfy three other elements than the traditional business judgment rule. Number one, the board of directors must show that it had reasonable grounds to believe that a danger to corporate policy and effectiveness was posed by the takeover attempt. And number two, all three of these elements are required, so they're all ands. The board of directors acted primarily to protect the corporation and its shareholders from the danger that was posed. And finally, the third element is that the defense tactic used was reasonable in relation to the threat posed. And this third element imposes a higher standard on the board of directors than the rational basis requirement of the business judgment rule. The rational basis requirement, if you recall, just required an officer or a director to articulate some logical reason that they believed they were acting in the best interest of the corporation. Under the Unical rule, it is a higher standard of proving that the tactic was reasonable in comparison to the threat that was posed to the corporation. So the first case that we're going to talk about in this session is the Paramount versus Times case, which illustrates the application of the Unical rule in a hostile takeover setting. Now, the facts of the Paramount versus Time case are a little complicated, so let's spend the first part of this segment setting out what those facts were, and then we'll get to see how the court evaluated them under the Unical rule. In 1988, Time's business was that it was a news publication. They owned certain newspapers, they put out Time magazine, and the board of directors of Time decided that they could further the business if they acquired an entertainment company, that there would be some synergies there between Time as a journalistic entity and an entertainment company that was involved in motion picture production and distribution. So the board of directors decided that it would be in the best interest for Time's future to find an entertainment company that they could merge with or acquire. And Time spent some effort evaluating the various entertainment companies. And they decided that Warner Communications, Inc. was the best fit for what Time wanted to do. So Time began negotiating with Warner Communications to enter into a merger, to join the two companies together. During the course of these negotiations, Time was insistent, however, that Time had to be the majority owner in the new business that was formed. And the reason why Time insisted on this was because Time wanted to keep control over its journalistic integrity. Time had developed a very good reputation as being a reputable, reliable source of news, editorial integrity, and it didn't want to turn control over their new company over to someone else who might not share that same interest in maintaining their integrity. But Warner Communications said to Time's request, forget it. We are by far the much more valuable company as compared to you, and we aren't going to merge and then give you 51% control of the company. So the negotiations broke down. The parties went their separate way for a while, but then someone came up with a solution to the problem. And that was that Time and Warner's would merge into one company. Warner's would have majority interest, majority ownership of that merged company, but it would create a committee of the board of directors and delegate to that committee the responsibility for upholding the journalistic integrity of the newly merged company. And it said to Time, you can put your representatives on that board. So we'll own the majority of the company. We'll have say in other aspects of the company, but with respect to journalistic integrity and the way you want the news portion of this company to proceed, your representatives will be in charge of that. And that satisfied Time. It was the right solution to the problem. So Time and Warner's agreed that they were going to go forward with this planned merger. And at the time they reached this agreement, Paramount Communications, another entertainment company, thought, yeah, you know what? Merging with a news organization like Time would be a fantastic idea. We think that would be in Paramount's best interest. But Time wasn't interested in Paramount. Time was interested in Warner's Communications. So Paramount decided to thwart the pending merger between Time and Warner's, that it would make a tender offer to the shareholders of Time in order to gain a majority control of Time. And then it would own Time, not Warner's. So, in furtherance of this hostile takeover attempt, Paramount made a tender offer for all of Time's shares at a price of $175 per share. And this was a significant offer to the shareholders of Time, because when this tender offer was made, Time shares were trading at $126 per share. So this was almost 33% more. Another $50. That's actually more than 33%. So almost $50 a share above what the shares were trading at. And Time's board of directors rejected Paramount's offer. As many board of directors do, they said no to the purported hostile takeover. But now Time and Warner's had a problem, because the way they had structured their initial agreement was a way that would require Time shareholders to approve the proposed merger with Warner's. And now Time got worried because they had this tender offer out there, right? $50 more than what your shares are currently traded at. And now we're asking you to forget about this and let us go ahead and merge with Warner's. And Time was concerned that they wouldn't get shareholder approval to go forward with the merger. So in response to that, Time and Warner's restructured the way that they were going to do the merger. And they restructured it in a way that took away the requirement of shareholder approval. Right? They took it out of the hands of the shareholders. Once again, just as Time and Warner's had restructured their agreement and were about to go forward with their merger, which now does not require shareholder approval, Paramount improved its tender offer. it raised its offer to $200 per share, $75 per share, more than what Time shares were currently trading at. And Time's board of directors also rejected this tender offer. So this irritated Time's shareholders to no end, and it also irritated Paramount Communications that desperately wanted to acquire Time. So Time's board of directors was sued both by Paramount Communications and Time shareholders. And Paramount and Time shareholders asked the court to prevent Time's merger with Warner's from going forward. So what did the court do? The court first of all noted that when Time restructured its merger agreement with Warner's to circumvent shareholder approval, that this was a defense to the hostile takeover attempt by Paramount, and therefore this action had to be evaluated under the modified business judgment rule or the Unical test. So in applying the Unical 3 elements, the court first of all found that Paramount's takeover attempt did pose a danger to Time's corporate policy and effectiveness. And that corporate policy was its strong desire to preserve its journalistic integrity by keeping control over the editorial decisions of whatever combined company was created. And Paramount was going to become a majority owner of Time without any agreement that Time would still maintain its journalistic integrity, unlike what Warner's had agreed to. So there was a threat and a danger to this important corporate policy. Secondly, the court found that the board of directors had acted primarily to protect the corporation from the danger of losing its journalistic integrity. And finally, the court found that it was reasonable for the board to defend against the takeover attempt in order to carry out the merger with Warner's that would advance Time's pre-existing and clearly articulated corporate goal of being able to create a new expanded company, but preserving its journalistic integrity and its ability to control the news side of the new corporation. So applying the Unical rule to the Paramount Communications case, the court said that Time's directors were protected in their decision because they had acted appropriately to carry out the corporate objectives, right, which were being threatened by Paramount's hostile takeover. And the court let the merger with Time and Warner's go through, and this was the birth of the Time Warner Company. So the lesson to take away from this case is that having well-defined corporate policies and objectives in place, right, and written down and backed up by corporate actions taken will strengthen a board's argument that a hostile takeover attempt threatens the corporate policy to allow the board of directors to thwart these takeover attempts. The next case that we're going to discuss has to do with the duty not to usurp corporate opportunities. This is one of the duties that Professor Williams talked about in her lecture. And in the Paramount case, we saw the birth of the Time Warner Company. And the case that we're going to look at to illustrate usurping corporate opportunities, we're going to look at the birth of the the Pepsi-Cola Company. In Guth versus Loft, Loft was a corporation that owned 115 soda fountain stores. You're all probably too young to remember soda fountain stores, and also I was in the Midwest where they were very popular. So soda fountain stores were these combined stores where you would walk through the door, and usually off to the left there was a counter with stools, and you could go sit at the counter and you would order some kind of soda float or a soda, or some kind of drink, or ice cream was basically what they served. And the other part of the store was kind of like a 99-cent store, except back in those days we called them five and dimes. So it was a number of inexpensive items that you could buy for a nickel or you could buy for a dime. Today, probably with inflation, it would be kind of like a 99-cent store. So on one side of the store, the soda booths, the fountains, and on the other side of the store where you could go buy little cheap trinkets. And Loft's president at the time was Charles Guth. And the soda fountain stores and making their sodas did what, when you go to McDonald's now and you stick your cup under the soda tap, right? The machine blends the syrup with whatever other ingredients there are to dispense to you your Coca-Cola or your Pepsi-Cola or whatever, your 7-Up. And the soda fountain stores did the same thing. They would buy the syrup for these sodas, and then at the store they'd get mixed together and come out with your soda. And at this point, the soda fountain stores used Coca-Cola syrup to make their colas, but the price of Coca-Cola syrup was very high. And Guth was unhappy at how high the price was, and he suggested to others at Loft, including the vice president, that they should look into buying Pepsi-Cola syrup and use that instead of Coca-Cola syrup. Just a few months after Guth had made this suggestion, Guth was personally contacted by a Pepsi representative who offered him the opportunity to buy Pepsi's secret formula and its trademark for $10,000. And rather than taking that offer back to Loft, remember Loft was actively looking for the Pepsi-Cola syrup to substitute for Coca-Cola syrup. But rather than doing that, Guth set up a new corporation that he controlled. And he used that corporation to buy Pepsi's secret formula and trademark that had been offered so that he owned that all to himself. And then to add insult to injury, he used Loft's money, Loft's plant and equipment, and its employees to produce Pepsi-Cola syrup for his other corporation. And because Guth dominated Loft's board of directors, he directed that Loft buy the Pepsi-Cola syrup from Guth's new corporation. And just 4 years after Guth had structured this transaction to allow another corporation to acquire the Pepsi secret formula and its trademark, Pepsi had grown to be a company worth several $1 million, right, in just 4 years' time. When Loft found out what went on and how this offer had been made just about the time right after Guth had asked or suggested that they acquire Pepsi-Cola syrup, Loft sued Guth, its president, right, and its director, claiming that Guth had usurped a corporate opportunity for himself. That when Loft was actively looking for a replacement of Coca-Cola syrup, and an offer was made to its president, Guth, to acquire Pepsi's formula and its trademark, that Guth had no right to take that opportunity for himself like he did, that was an opportunity that needed to have been presented to the corporation. So Loft sued Guth and asked the court to order that Guth had to transfer all of the shares of the Pepsi-Cola company back to Loft. And the court agreed with Loft that Guth had in fact usurped an opportunity that belonged to the corporation, not to Guth personally. And Guth was ordered to transfer all of the shares of his new corporation back to Loft, including all of the ownership of the Pepsi-Cola syrup and the Pepsi-Cola company. And not long after that, Loft changed its name to the Pepsi-Cola company. And there was the birth of Pepsi-Cola. The next problem that we're going to discuss, problem number 7, illustrates the duty of loyalty that is owed by a director of a corporation to the corporation. In problem 7, we have Simon Michael, who was a director of a corporation called Shocking Technologies, Inc. And Simon Michael was the director that had been elected to represent the preferred shareholders of the corporation. And Michael had some significant disagreements with the other board members over some corporate issues, including executive compensation. And also, Michael felt very strongly that the preferred shareholders need to have more representatives on the board of directors. And at the time when Michael was having this disagreement with the other board members, the company itself was in desperate need of funding. And it was in active negotiations with a company called Littelfuse to provide money to the company. And Littelfuse was going to make an equity investment. It was going to take an ownership interest in Shocking Technologies. As these negotiations were going on, Michael took it upon himself to meet with Littelfuse. And Michael gave that company extremely confidential information that Littelfuse was the only potential investor that Shocking had found. Now, if you are Littelfuse and you were in negotiation with Shocking Technologies to invest in the company, and you find out that you are the only company that they were able to find willing to make this investment, what do you think happens to the bargaining power of Littelfuse? Right? Knowing it has no other competitors, right? Its bargaining power is going to shoot way up. It can basically just make its demands because it knows that Shocking has nowhere else to go. Michael wanted this to happen. Michael wanted the corporation to get in an even greater cash crunch, because if it got even more desperate, Michael believed that it would force the other directors to implement Michael's objectives, to do what he wanted as far as executive compensation and as far as increased representation on the board for the preferred shareholders. And Michael truly believed in his heart that what he was doing was in the best interest of the corporation. So the question in problem 7 is, did Michael breach his fiduciary duties to Shocking Technology by having this meeting with Littelfuse and giving it confidential information when he believed that what he was doing was in the best interest of the company? And this was a pretty easy decision for the court to make. What Michael believed in his heart was in the best interest of the corporation did not excuse the fact that he gave confidential information of the corporation to a third party that it was in active negotiations with. So in problem 7, the court did in fact find that Michael breached his fiduciary duties to Shocking. The last case that we're going to talk about concerns the liability of officers and directors for crimes and torts that they commit on behalf of the corporation. Again, they are serving their master in a certain sense. They are doing it on behalf of the corporation. But are they liable for what they do if it is a crime or a tort? And the answer is yes. We are always responsible for the crimes and torts that we commit, even if we are doing it on behalf of our principal or on behalf of our employer. So the case that we're going to take a look at is the criminal case of United States versus Jensen. In United States versus Jensen, Stephanie Jensen was an officer of Brocade Communications, a corporation. And the office that she held, she was a vice president, and she was also director of human resources. Jensen participated in something that was unfortunately not uncommon back in these days. The rules have since been changed to prevent this, which was a scheme to backdate stock options, which is as we've talked about previously, it's an incentive for someone to do well to increase the value of the corporation to make the stock options valuable for them. But what was happening here is that stock options were being backdated. They weren't actually issued when they were saying that they were being issued, in order to allow higher up officers to reap a huge profit. And so Jensen participated in this scheme where she backdated stock options, not for herself, but for Brocade's chief executive officer, so that he could then exercise his options when the price of the stock was very high. And this scheme resulted in Brocade's financials being falsified by more than $100 million. And Jensen was criminally prosecuted and convicted for her actions in doing this. She wasn't the one benefiting from it. The chief executive officer was. She may say, I was acting on behalf of the corporation because keeping our chief executive officer happy is good for the corporation. But whatever her reason, she committed a crime, and she is responsible for that crime. The issue in this case was kind of an interesting issue. The issue in this case was whether or not she should get prison time for what she did, as opposed to just a fine. And there was a rule in this particular type of prosecution, right, that involves violating the rules of the Securities and Exchange Commission. That if you didn't know about the rule that you were violating, you could get fined, but you could not be sentenced to prison. So Jensen took the position in this case that she shouldn't go to prison even though she participated in the scheme, because she didn't know that there was any SEC rule out there that says you couldn't falsify your financial records as a corporation. So that's what this case is about. It's actually at the trial court level, and the trial court is evaluating her contention in deciding whether or not the trial court can sentence her to prison. And the case concludes, come on. Okay. You are vice president of this corporation, director of human resources. You engaged in backdating stock options, which resulted in falsifying your financial records significantly, and you didn't know that there was a rule out there prohibiting that. So the court didn't believe her, and the court, in fact, sentenced her to prison for what she had done.